Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Come on in. We're just letting all the folks in, so it'll just take a second. I was so glad that you all are here joining us. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. Just letting some more people in. How we do? All right. Welcome, welcome. Hello. Some of you probably have your cameras on, which is great. You can choose to have them on or off, whatever feels more comfortable for you. But we do ask that you stay muted during the conversation so we can make sure that we hear the speakers. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Sari Kamen. I'm the Public Programs Director of MOFAD, Museum of Food and Drink. We're based in New York City. I know many of you are not in New York City tonight, which is so exciting, which is why we love doing virtual programming. There's a little chat function at the bottom of your screen. I just wrote, I think I'm gonna type in now. Hi. That was weird, but tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know where everybody is based. Always super exciting to find that out, and feels it's very affirming to have people from so many different locations gathered together. Hello from San Jose. So as some of you know, this is part of a 3-part virtual series called Fruiting Bodies that we have been doing, and sadly, this is the last of the 3 parts. So we're so glad that you can be with us for this evening. We are recording. You will get the link to watch the recording tomorrow, just in case you want to watch it again. So first of all, I want to thank Simran, who is moderating. She is not only moderating this conversation, but she also curated all 3 of the conversations. And this has just been something that's been in the works for so long. So it's really amazing to, have all the feels to be at the last part of this incredible trilogy that she put together. So we're so honored that she chose to partner with MOFAD, and really grateful for all the work. So in addition to Simran, and I will say more about her momentarily, I want to introduce Karlos Baca, who is an Indigenous food activist and founder of Taste of Native Cuisine, which is an Indigenous food cooperative, which was created alongside the Southern Ute Cultural Center and Museum in Southwestern Colorado. He also founded Fourth World Farm in Mancos, Colorado, which is focused on pre-colonial foods, agricultural systems, and education. He spends most of his time teaching, working to decolonize food systems, and pushing for more Indigenous food sovereignties on a tribal level. He's the co-founder of the Indigenous food activist group iCollective, which uses Indigenous foodways as a medium to combat structural white supremacy and continued warfare against Indigenous people, and is the writer of A Gathering Basket Cookbook, which is a monthly multimedia publication, which I really hope we hear more about tonight. And of course, most importantly, he's a son, father, uncle, and grandfather. And then we have Simran Sethi, a journalist, an academic, a consultant. Her current research is focused on exploring ways to dismantle systems of oppression in support of the biocultural diversity of sacred plant medicines. She is the founder of Asian Psychedelic Collective, an evolving space of belonging and support for Asians working with and in psychedelics. And she is the author of an amazing book called Bread, Wine, Chocolate, The Slow Loss of Foods We Love, which was named one of the best food books of 2016 by the Smithsonian. You should absolutely run out and get it if you haven't read it yet. It was the reason I met her, was introduced to her through this book, and I'm so happy we've continued our relationship working together. So I will now turn it over to them, and there will be time at the end for Q&A, and you can use the little chat function and type in your questions, but feel free to comment throughout. Thank you so much, Simran.
Thank you, Sari, for that generous introduction. I love working with you. I'm so grateful to all you do and to what MOFAD does to really expand and explore dialogues around food and culture. For me, this relationship with mushrooms has come in many forms: culinary, medicinal, psychedelic, all around, they all sort of return to the place of healing and sustenance. And along the way, I became just fascinated with fungal intelligence and the potential of mushrooms and the symbolism of all that lies beneath what we see. And that that's why our sort of our time together in this series has sort of had this beautiful arc of starting with Juliana Forci, who really talked to us about like what it means for something to be born out of decay, and moving on to Jennifer Doe talking about Asian representation, and sort of the role that medicinal mushrooms have played, but also the erasure of Asian culture in many of these dominant, global North conversations about mushrooms. And it means the world to me that we are concluding this series with M. Karlos. M. Karlos, I'm so grateful to you for the work that you've done, for all that I've learned from you, and that like I'm just sort of like awestruck that I get to spend this next hour in dialogue with you. So thank you for being here.
No, thank you for having me. It's an honor and a privilege to sit with y'all, and looking forward to some wonderful conversation.
Thank you. When we had our first conversation about this series, you said mushroom people are just different, and so I want to start there with that question: how are mushroom people different?
Ooh, how many colors are in the rainbow? Let's see. Yeah, I mean, this goes with anything, with any botanist, horticulturalist, arborist, anybody that gets into the place that they occupy. You don't really know. Let me touch on like indigeneity, right? You say like indigeneity is the definition of being in a place, right? And like your space and your relationship to, and how you play your part in that system. And as soon as you begin to equate your being with these relatives, whether they be mushrooms or plants or trees or whoever, I don't think that you can help but be shifted. I don't think that there's any way that you are able to maintain like the normalized ideals of civilization. Throw that in quotes real quick, and the way that I'm sorry you guys are hearing my cat fighting with the bed over here. I apologize. But it's formative, right? There's no way that you can be shifted, and especially when it comes to fungi and the way that those systems, and I teach this often with traditional plants and medicines in general, is how we can reflect what colonization looks like through conversations on mycelium and through the way things are broken down and composted, so that's my vision of it, I guess.
Say more about that. When you say, I mean, that is sort of the essence of what this conversation is meant to be. When you say you can see the impacts of colonization through the mycelium, what exactly do you mean?
I can let me speak from where I'm sitting right now, right? So I'm here at home in a place currently called Mancos, Colorado. I have a farm here called Fourth World Farm, and this space was once one of they call it like the plains of on the other side of the Rockies, right? And so the grasslands here were so rich that bison, antelope, mountain sheep, rams, all these things. It was massive scale here. And as soon as the Spaniards came into this space, they shifted the water table. They brought the cows, they brought the pigs, they brought all these things. And instead of the space that was cultivated for our relatives and for their prosperity and ours, all of a sudden there was a shift towards self and privatization and monetary gain and enclosure, right? And so that happened for a few hundred years, and then that was followed up by Mormon colonization in these valleys, which continued the livestock, which continued these things, plus the deforestation. And so the space that we're in is I believe the first dairy here in the Southwest of this region. Like the barn that we have out here is well over 100 years old. But the land is completely eradicated of any indigenous species that has anything to do with anything. Not one tree, not one bush, not any native grass, not a shrub, no mycelium, right? And then over the course of these last 5 years, we've begun restructuring that. And I have to speak towards the Ute form of agriculture, which there's not really terminology for it, but I call it cultivation in motion. As a people that traveled these mountains everywhere from, you say, like just north of Taos Pueblo in New Mexico, all the way up sometimes as far as Montana, all the way over into Nevada, and then over into the plains. So it's a pretty massive, massive space to constantly be moving ecosystems. And I have the benefit and the thing that a lot of indigenous folks don't have or haven't had in a while, is that my grandparents still maintained a lot of those ways. And so I was able to garner a lot of plant information, a lot of medicines and foods and things like that. And so my ecosystem has always been the main thing and main focus in my vision. I always am like, what's this? What's that? What is it? How things change every season. What's here this year? What's not there this year? Why? What's the weather pattern? Like what happened here? That's enabled me to cultivate both the wild things and reintroduce. I think we've reintroduced, I can't even, somewhere probably near 80 different indigenous species here. I was just talking to my son about this yesterday, about being here in the middle of all these hay fields and this massive agriculture that just depletes the land and the water. That, if you guys are familiar with seed bombs and making a seed bomb, that's what this place is, right? Because none of this stuff really exists outside of here. So as we're planting and building these things and watching it go, there's all these things are being spread again, and they're getting pushed back into their ecosystem. And one of those things that really came to, like, on the closest property to ours, there's a cottonwood tree. And so pretty much right under that, we put the understory of choke cherries. In this region, blonde morels are real heavy in that ecosystem. And so making mushroom slurries with the morel and putting them in with the root base in there, just starting there and starting in those spaces. And as we're rebuilding, reforesting some areas, and shrubs and forbs and grasses in other areas, and where there was never mushrooms, we had a really heavy rain season this last year, which is a beautiful thing for a place. We're in our 22nd year of consecutive drought here, and so it was a pretty big deal. But mushrooms everywhere that we've given back to the land, everything that we've put back in has brought back that fruiting, right? And so when you look at colonization and those effects, you can look at European, like I can say, looking at European colonization and say a lobster mushroom, for instance, right? So having severed all these other ways to where you're unable to produce fruit yourself, that you become a parasitic thing and you latch on to another mycelial network to produce your fruit, right? And so those kinds of conversations are pretty real. You know, they're easy reflections to see in the indigenous landscape and in the ongoing warfare against indigenous peoples globally, not just here, you know. So
as you share this, I think about something that we discussed in our first conversation, just that fungi have survived all 5 mass extinctions, and they show us how to keep going. They're such an extraordinary example of resilience. And it just, when you were speaking, you know, what came up for me is that and that awareness that, you know, so much of our DNA, like 50% of our DNA, is shared with fungi. And that when I hear you speaking and I think about what I read in A Gathering Basket, which I want to touch on, it's just, you know, the mycelia as relative, you know, as family.
yeah, I mean, definitely. You say I always look of, you know, like there's this second installment of the major motion picture of colonization in Avatar that's out right now, you know. And when you speak of, you know, like what's reflected in that movie and that tree in particular, that gives them life, right? And we're thinking about the lack of conversation about what gives that tree life, you know, and those things. It's not the scene that produces life on this planet, right? It's not those things that you can catch with your eye. And so I think it's, you know, it's a massive conversation to have.
And it's
Definitely.
humbling. And you're making reference, I haven't seen the movie for that very reason. Like, don't
No,
have a lot of interest in it, but I think
nor am
about
I.
what's going on. Yeah. To even this, like, growing fascination with mushrooms, you know, that they have been part of indigenous and global South cultures always. But if you look here in this moment in time, the public face of, you know, the fungi fascination is overwhelmingly white. And
Mhm.
I know that you've called this a blatant example of cultural misappropriation. And I'm curious,
Yeah.
what is that? What do you feel when you see this sort of this erasure happening again in real time?
I think it's fascinating, right? So I live really close to Telluride, Colorado, right? So Telluride Mushroom Festival is the biggest mushroom festival in the country. And I attend pretty much every year, you know. I think that the cultural landscape of that space is overwhelmingly, you know, 99.9% white. And this year they had posted something on it, I believe on their Instagram, about how do you, if you'd like to win tickets, tell us why you'd like to attend. And I posted on there, because you need indigenous perspective, and Ute perspective in particular, because you're on Ute lands.
Mm.
And so I won these tickets, and my brother Randolph Scott and I went. And being in this space, like the very first 15 minutes of being in this space. My brother was wearing a shirt that says decolonize it, and it's the outlines of the so-called Americas. And a man looks at his shirt and says, nice shirt, that'll never happen. This is 15 minutes in. We in the midst of all that, we're going to a talk about psychedelics in particular. And it was a white man speaking, and he started off by speaking about Maria Sabina and about how things had been, how whiteness had destroyed her in a lot of ways, right? And how we needed to be really careful about that moving forward, and that they wanted to recognize that as a circumstance of white supremacy.
Let me jump in real quick and explain to our folks who Maria Sabina is. Indigenous woman from Oaxaca, Mexico, who introduced the sacred psychedelic mushrooms to Gordon Wasson, a white man, white American, who actually had learned about mycology through his wife. But then he ended up coming back to the US. Please fill in if I'm not getting the whole story here. And then Sabina had requested this curandera, this healer, please, don't show my identity, right? And he had taken photos of her and ended up writing an article for Life magazine, I think it was. And then people started flocking to that area. And is that sort of, I just want to make sure I've given people enough information to track with you.
Yeah, for sure. And she, in a lot of ways, in her own community, was outcast for that action by that man, right? By that creation of that circumstance, and while he's recognizing this, and mind you, all of the things that we participated in there, not one person ever mentioned anything about indigeneity or the land that they're on or anything. And I was like, oh, cool. Well, that's nice. At least he's making the effort. And then he turns around and starts talking about, I don't know why my brain's pulling up a blank right now, but there's a Zionist company, marijuana company that's really pushing into the psychedelic realm right now. And he goes on to praise them. And I'm sitting there like, is there like this, what's the disconnect there? On one end, you're saying this, and then you're going right into a regime that is ethnically cleansing a whole people, and this is this kind of thing, right? And then, to close the thing out, they have a parade at the end of the day, or at the end of the thing, and we go just because it's ridiculous and funny, and it's like all of that realm of the mushroom peoples. And we're standing there, and a white man comes up to us, the only two indigenous folks in the whole space, and he says, are you the ones holding the ceremony? Are you guys going to be running the ceremony? And we look at each other, and we're like, look at him, we're like, what? And he goes on to ask this question, and we're just like looking at each other like, are you shitting me right now, right? Like, you just picked out these two indigenous men to come ask if we're holding a ceremony. And then our response, he said, you two are you guys are the rudest people I've had encounter with the entire time of this entire week or whatever, and walked off. We were just like, oh, right. And that's that space. That's what it's like to be indigenous in that space. So it's a thing, it's really real. And it's
a variation on that, I feel, in so-called new age and yogic spaces where there are a lot of assumptions made on of South Asian descent and
right,
taking and little giving. And I'm curious, there's so much talk about decolonization and reciprocity, and I would love for you to share in very tangible ways, as an indigenous person, what that looks like and feels like what that really is, versus what the marketing version and what the hippie-go-lucky version is.
Right. There's a lot to that. We speak often as the I collective, and just for instance, right? Like anybody that's viewing that's not familiar with the I collective, we have somewhere near, I don't know, maybe 30 members, and we have members from Oaxaca to First Nation Cree. Like this is massive scale of indigenous farmers and chefs and seed keepers and knowledge keepers, that protocol for us as indigenous people is to know whose space we're going into. So say we go to New York City and you're on Lenape land. So we've done, numerous dinners in that space, and anywhere that we go in this country to go do an event, we always feed that community first, and we speak to them and ask their permission to even be there. This is what we're going to be doing. If we come into your space, this is what we represent. We'd like your blessing, and we'd like to feed you. And so when we're in these spaces, and especially in that space of the academia and the Stamets and the, those, that realm, they always want to ask, have you spoken to any of the indigenous people of this space? Have you said, hey, do you think it would be cool if we went and harvested mushrooms in this land? Have you ever asked permissions? Have you ever understood a protocol? Right. And like that may be a little difficult for some folks, but then there's like super Italians. We're like going back to Paul Stamets, the fantastic
mycologist. Yeah.
Yes. We did an article with the Washington Post about Fantastic Fungi, the movie, earlier this year, or maybe middle of last year. And article was questioning how this cookbook and this whole thing came out, and it's all white, right? And they had reached out to me, asked me how I felt about it, and I was recognizing. I said, I tried to watch the movie, and it comes to a part where Paul Stamets is showing off his collection of mushroom entities, mushroom relatives that he has procured from down south. And I said, I spoke to that. I turned it off at that moment. I said, oh, so you guys not only are you excluding the people whose land you're on from this conversation, but you're also going to rub it in their face that you have all of these stolen artifacts and the largest collection of these stolen artifacts, and what's the technical response to that?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It caused a pretty big ruckus in his circle in particular. His people wrote some pretty crazy emails, and the response to it, instead of, well, I'll tell you his response to it was that nothing he had was stolen, but that he had put it in his will to have them returned when he passed. And my question is, why wouldn't you return them right now and do the right thing, right? That's how simple it is. Like, that's what the tangibility of it is. It's not, there's the spectrum of which I speak on is there's this, you know, reaching out to the people's land who you're on and saying, asking for permission, and then there's this other aspect, right? And so I don't know, there's the spectrum is wide in that conversation.
Right. Absolutely. I, you know, I'm really sort of humbled by the things that you're sharing, because they are, I see people being quite boastful about what they've taken. And I'm not just referring to sort of like the effigy, but just the energy of like, I went to this place, I had this experience, I took this thing, I ate this thing, I bought this thing. And it is, you know, part of that larger extractive economy. And I'm curious to know, you know, if that's something, you know, as someone who has been raised in, you know, on Turtle Island, what is now known as the United States, you know, I know that you said that you had mentioned that the colonial imprint in regards to how things were supposed to sort of be done when it came to food also was something that you had to kind of grow an awareness of and work on yourself. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I'll give it a shot. we I'll say, you know, colonization, I say this probably every single day of my life in talking to people, is that colonization does its job very well. And how that manifests itself, you know, I mean, if you follow anything in the world, I'm sure you've heard of the boarding school circumstances that are going on, and the mass annihilation of Indigenous youth in these places, and the, you know, the mental scarring and those things like that. I can say my grandmother, who turns 90 here in a couple weeks, me being out in the world and coming home, and English was the first language there, right? Although my grandfather spoke Ute, and he spoke Dene, and he spoke Spanish, and he spoke English, and he spoke some Korean, and some, you know, from wartime. And I know my grandmother's first language was her people's language, and I thought it would be beautiful for me to be able to have some conversation with her like that, and I attempted to, and she looked at me, and she said, "I don't remember." And it wasn't until the understanding of what boarding schools were and what boarding schools had done that I realized the pain that would bring for her, right? And so if you look at that, was just 2 generations ago. What does that effect have, right? And you're talking about in the Americas 528 years of, you know, constant colonization. In learning language and undoing the traumas that have been inflicted. I don't know if, I think we talked about this in our previous talk, and I was saying, you know, your environment, you have to treat in the same way that you would treat your lover. You have to have the same respect and the same love and the same want to nourish the place you exist in as the love that you have for your children, for your grandparents, for whoever. Because that understanding and that recognition of responsibility that you have to the place that you reside in is what transforms you. It's what creates, it is what is implicit in the word indigenous. So in my process and through my growth and my change and my healing of my own traumas and the lineal and the modern, that has been the utmost savior. And you can talk to, I would guarantee, the vast majority of
Think there's a situation of you being frozen.
Yeah, I think we have Carlos frozen for a moment. Well, I guess while we wait for that situation to get rectified, if people have questions for Simran in the meantime, you can start. Yeah, it looks like Carlos popped off, so hopefully he'll come right back on. But if you have questions for Simran, you can start putting them in the chat. Hopefully he will be back in a moment. I also forgot to mention at the beginning of the evening that the past two programs that we did in this series are on our YouTube. So if you miss those, you can go and watch them anytime. And then this program also will eventually end up on our YouTube as well. And Simran, I just want to thank you again, because this is such a beautiful conversation, and it really is such an honor to be able to work with you and hear you speak and hear M. Carlos speak as well.
Thank you, Sari. I mean, I just, while he's coming back, what is really just coming up for me is just, it's relational over transactional, right? It's like the humility and the loss of mother tongue. Like, I was just with my mother and we were thinking about, I was looking at photos of my grandmother and my great grandparents, and I was taught English, like Punjabi wasn't the language of the United States of America. Like, the way I was able to communicate with her was so limited. Here comes M. Carlos, by the way. And it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. And you can see how that willful erasure, what that does and how that continues to live through us. So yeah, thank you again for creating space for these important conversations.
Yeah, of course. I mean, just what he was saying about, asking permission to be in other people's spaces, how that's just so, second nature for Indigenous folks. But I think for the majority of people who walk around the planet, like myself, I mean, that's just like that just rocked me to think about just being that considerate and conscientious about not just whose land you're on, but whose space you're in at any given time. And it's really beautiful. Hi, Carlos.
I am Carlos. Welcome back. Yeah. And what happens beyond the, this is the land I'm on, right?
Exactly.
Like, that's performative. There's a performative possibility of that I'm always hyper aware of,
Yeah. I mean, that was something that I just learned from him, like to think about as someone who uses space for curating conversations. And, often I'm just thinking about who are the people in the room, but not even thinking about the space itself as its own physical entity and what history is there. And there's so many layers. So thank you, M. Carlos, for making me think about that this evening. You should be able to unmute yourself at this point.
All right. Apparently my internet, these are the joys of living out in the country. It just decided to stop. So I'm came in on my phone.
It happens. It happens. We've all seen it. It's okay. Please continue the conversation.
Yeah,
like I said, we're gonna start Q&A pretty soon, so you can feel free, everyone watching, to start putting your questions in the chat as well.
Carlos, are you trying to join us from two spots? That's what we're getting that feedback.
I think you just need to mute one of them. Oh, there we go. Okay. The joys of Zoom.
There you go. Welcome back.
Okay.
Sweet. But can you unmute yourself? And then we're really good. Yeah.
We're really good. Thanks everyone for your patience. Sorry for that.
Ridiculousness. That's the first time that my internet has ever done that in a Zoom meeting. So anyhow,
Of course.
We've all had that first. I have to just own it for myself. So I just yeah, thank you for hopping back on.
yeah, of course.
You know, you were speaking of sort of what it means to really honor a place, I think. And before we move to questions from the audience, I'd love to, if you would, just share about your maybe early experience with love of place and with your own harvesting of mushrooms. Like, can you share a story from maybe when you were young and you were first introduced to mushrooms, if you remember?
Well, there's multiple layers in this conversation, because we say in Ute culture, they so mushroom is called Nusakukan, and is actually taboo. And I've asked quite a few elders and a few different folks about what does that mean. And there's like a missing piece to the story of why. And in my studies, I guess, how do I put it? In my studies, I guess the way that archaeologists and anthropological language is coded when it comes to those first contact and like post subjugation war camp scenarios, and the questioning about those things is they didn't really ask multiple people questions. So there's not this like understanding of like, yes, maybe this clan doesn't use mushrooms, but no, this clan over here uses them for medicine. This clan over here has massive foodways with these things, you know? And so I didn't even really get introduced. I think when I was 13, was my first experience with gathering mushrooms. And at that age, this might shock some people, but psilocybin was what I was introduced to initially. Which they'll tell you psilocybins don't exist in Colorado. I disagree wholeheartedly. That relationship, coming from where I come from and understanding that they're a being, and understanding that there is an actual the spirit that resides within them is a teacher. And this ceremony, the ceremony of those things, you know, whether that be, I keep having this flash of this was at the store earlier and there's a sticker that said legalize DMT, and how pissed off it made me. And so I came up in this space. I'd have to go into like my whole history. I'll tell you guys that I left home really, really early. In that age bracket, 13, 14 years old. And the folks that I was around that I learned this from were not Indigenous folk. And their understanding of it turned me off from it instantaneously.
Their understanding of mushrooms.
Yes, their way of being with it, and that it was a means to get high, and there was no. It was relegated to being a drug and something that you use instead of it being a medicine and a teacher like I was taught. And so that first introduction, I did meet them, right? And I did learn who they were and begin that cultivation of a relationship with them. And that sparked a instantaneous relationship. Like instantaneously was like, oh, okay, well, who's this relative and who's this relative? And so that was the spark, right? That was how, going from that at 13 to now having mushroom hunted across the country consistently for, I'm almost 47. So it's like the whole, I mean, I guess that to kind of like going more into your question is that I've been blessed to be able to spend time and work with and learn from and teach in Indigenous communities all across the country. And the amount of knowledge and the importance of mushrooms can't be overstated to 85% of the tribes that I've spent time with. So those relationships are foundational. Like maybe mycelial would be the word, in this conversation. I think that's the best place to leave it.
That is, and when we overlook, when we disregard indigeneity, this is the wisdom that we lose. This is, this gift. So thank you for being here. I would love to open up to a few questions before we depart. I'm not seeing any, but maybe let me do a little quick review of the chat here, because I could keep talking.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah. Yes. Will you please talk about the I Collective cookbook and a gathering basket while you're at it, please?
Yeah, definitely. So a gathering basket is a project that, I guess its foundation was this is like our very first gathering that we had as an actual unit. We finished our week of events and doing all these things, and it's like 3 a.m. and everybody's exhausted. We're talking about, what does the future look like? And what do we want to see happen? And of course, a cookbook came up. And people have been asking me for a decade to, like, when is the Taste of Native Cuisine cookbook coming out? When are you coming out with a cookbook? And I always said I wouldn't put out a cookbook because it's not about me. And the reflection of cookbooks in this capitalist realm that we exist in is about self. It's about the chef and the patriarchal vision of the kitchen and those things. And what we do is about our people. And so it took a lot of years to actually formulate what that looked like. And this last year, we finally put together how that would look, and we came up with the Gathering Basket. It's a multimedia cookbook project that we put out an issue a month, and it's a cookbook only in that it has recipes in it, but really it's in a Native history book. It's the stories of the people and what colonization has done to them, how it's affected their water, how it's affected their land, how it's affected their knowledge base, how it's affected their food systems. And while the I Collective is the host of it, and I am the main writer of it, when we're going into issue 15 here in a couple weeks, and we've had input from well over 60 Indigenous folks from all over, from El Salvador, Belize, Sonora, all across the US, Canada, Alaska, because going back to responsibilities and growing those networks, growing that mycelial mass, is that we have a responsibility and obligation to our people because we have a massive platform. Our platform is reaches around the world, and we're just the tiniest fraction of any of the story. And it was really important for us to make sure that the communities that we wanted to showcase told their own stories, that it was their voice, their artwork, their pictures, their lived history being reflected in the pages of this thing. So that's where we're at with it. You can go to icollectiveinc.org and get subscriptions to it in whole or buy single issues.
It's beautiful. It's, yeah.
We'll
I strongly urge everyone to do that very thing.
We'll be coming out with the we're only scheduled for 18 issues. We'll see what happens after that, but after the 18th issue, we'll be going into production of a hardback. And another piece of this conversation too that's really important is that it's written by, designed by, the art is by, the poetry is by, the videos, the language, everything is by Indigenous hands. We have no outside input, and I think when we talk about narrative shift, that's also part of that. That's like the importance of that is that that's the case. And so we're building the book in-house, and we'll be going through a Native publisher.
That's what reclamation feels like. That's beautiful. If it's okay with you, I want to go 5 minutes over and ask these last two questions.
Yeah.
What are your plans and future vision for your farm?
Ooh, well, I didn't even really touch base too much on the farm.
We have to do a follow-up.
Yeah, there's that space, and then there's this, actual cultivation space where I'm focused on predominantly rematriated foods. If you don't know what rematriation is, there's this massive history of, along with the cultural destruction and the land destruction, is the procuring of our people's seeds. And in a lot of cases, especially for East Coast tribes that got moved to Oklahoma, all the tribes in that region that were pushed out of their lands and brought their seeds with them that didn't grow. A lot of these places have more institutions, universities, museums, private holders, seed companies, that a lot of these seeds have, there's a few really amazing Indigenous seed keepers and women in particular who have taken it on their shoulders to go into these places and bring those seeds home. And so some of the seeds that we have here, one is a corn land race that is one of the, I don't know if anybody's familiar with Southwest, but Mesa Verde National Park is like my backyard. It's one of our oldest ancestral home sites in this region. Massive city. This whole space in the Southwest is one of the largest cities in existence. There's only a few land races of corn that are still tied to that space, and we grow one of them. Another one of those is the constellation corn, which is sometimes called robin's egg corn, which was pretty functionally extinct in a lot of ways. I managed to get my hands over a massive amount of time, like a decade, on a handful of seeds from the region and from families that barely had any to give. That we've brought that back, that's our main crop of corn, to where we can actually send cobs of it out to the Indigenous farmers. The beans, I wrote an article for Kitchen recently, and it speaks about the whole process of what we're doing there. But we have heritage turkey, we have Navajo churro sheep, and just, it's not like my son points out regularly, you'll probably be dead by the time any of this stuff comes into fruition. And I've been pretty vocal about the fact that has nothing to do with me, it has to do with him, has to do with the future. And going touching back on what that seed bomb looks like, right? And how it radiates out, and these seeds get to go back to fields and hands that haven't had them there in ages, in century plus in some circumstances. So that's where we're at.
That is a beautiful transition to this final question. Just speaking to sort of the future, like, who are a few of your mentors? And similarly, who among the younger generations are you excited to see continue the work?
My mentors. This is going to be a funny answer that nobody's expecting. I work with a school called the Deep School, which is a charter school in the Navajo Nation, doing plant medicine, mushroom gathering, and things like that. And I also work with Shining Mountain Health, at home. It's on Southern Ute Reservation, which is where I'm from. Teaching classes to predominantly mothers and kids. And whereas I used to think that my elders, who are definitely invaluable and who definitely modeled and molded the way that I've grown to be, and I love and honor and respect them. But these kids, these youth, these young ones that are in a space and have this opportunity that we never had. Seeing just here to the northeast of me is the Beinsa, which is the North Navajo Sacred Mountain. And we had a whole bus, like a literal bus full of Dene youth come to the farm, and then we went up there this year, this last summer, last fall. Went and gathered, learned about mushrooms, did some harvesting, and there was this recognition that, for me, of when was the last time that there were 50 plus Dene kids on this mountain singing the songs that were written for these mountains themselves. And being in that space and watching their excitement and watching how their worries and their traumas just melted away, harvesting berries or learning about mushrooms or breathing that mountain air and being in this place that their relatives have spent tens of thousands of years cultivating relationship that they're removed from. And what a blessing that is. And so those are my mentors.
Thank you. So grateful for this conversation.
Well, thank you.
Whew. Thank you. Thank you so much, Carlos. That was tremendous. Thank you so much for your generosity in sharing everything that you did this evening. And I truly, truly hope we can reconnect with you and your iCollective colleagues and do another program when the book has physicality to it, and we can figure that out and we can gather together, both maybe virtually and hopefully in person too at some point. That would be such an honor for us.
Definitely. Thank you.
And congratulations and best of luck with that endeavor. It's so exciting and beautiful. Simran, this has just been so phenomenal, and each conversation has been so unique and so different and so poignant and just its own very separate way. So I love that it was a series, but each conversation was just its own entity, and wow, I learned so much. Thank you so much for trusting in us to host this. So good night, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. And I'll email you tomorrow with lots of information.
Yeah, everybody have a good night.
Take care. Thank you again.
Bye.
Yep.